Well, are vaccines still as valuable as they once were? I'll let you make your own opinion up about that. Joe Rogan, he's questioning it. He's one of the world's leading opinion leaders. And he says, you know what? Prior to the pandemic, I would have thought that these vaccines were the greatest thing ever. Now, I'm not so sure. So, I'm Dr. Bob Rakowski, wellness transformation expert, 3 decades in clinical practice, treating every demographic of patient, as well as lecturing all over the world over 6 different continents, 10,000 hours of seminars on functional medicine and natural medicine. So, we're going to talk about life before vaccines, and then we'll talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of vaccines. And there's some of all the above. So, if we go back to caveman times, now I wasn't there, but I asked AI, hey, what did the cavemen die from? Number one, infectious disease. Number two, trauma and violence. Number three, malnutrition. You might be surprised that it took nearly to the year 2000 to change those causes of death. We go to ancient Rome, infectious disease, waterborne disease, which is probably infectious disease, and trauma and or violence. So look at this. Infectious disease, trauma, and malnutrition stopped being the top causes of death around the late 1990s. So that beautiful picture of that woman there, that's Hygeia, the goddess of good health. Cleanliness is next to godliness. If we clean up our body, mind, and spirit and the environment, it's a proven path to much better health. So when we start looking at the decline in death rate from infectious disease, we go back to 1900 and we look and we realize that nearly 80% of deaths were infectious disease. We had a bunch of trauma and violence. We had a bunch of malnutrition. So how have we done today? Well, prior to 2021, there was an 85% reduction in death rate from infectious disease. Trauma and violence, US, it was down by 35%. The rest of the world, it actually increased. That's horrible, right? And malnutrition, they're getting it wrong here. AI has it wrong. Malnutrition is the number one cause of death. It's just a different kind of malnutrition. There's nothing in our food anymore. So there's good in the vaccines. When you start looking at smallpox, there's a book, Smallpox, Death of Disease. It is definitely exaggerated, too much credit to the vaccine, but we'll give it some. So it goes back to 11th century China. They would take powdered smallpox pustules and blow it up an individual's nose. I don't think that would be very fun, but that helped to prevent a deadly and disfiguring disease. This was a slave. His name was Onesimus, if I'm pronouncing that right. He was actually treated or vaccinated for smallpox. They called it variolation in Africa. And when there was a smallpox outbreak in Boston, he said, look, why don't you try this? Take the pustules, scrape them into a new person. And he likely saved a lot of people. That took the death rate, they called that variolation, from 1 in 7 of smallpox to 1 in 40. So nearly a 6-fold improvement in survivability. Now, I almost said Bruce Jenner, Caitlyn Jenner. Jenner was the guy that created the smallpox vaccine, and it was a brilliant observation. He noticed that milkmaids rarely ever got smallpox, or if they did, it was very, very mild. But what they tended to get was cowpox, which seems similar. So he ended up taking a milkmaid's, smallpox or a cowpox pustule, cutting it open, then scratching it into the arm of a young boy. A few weeks later, then inoculated him for smallpox. And guess what? Very, very mild case, no changes whatsoever. And that was the birth of vaccination, which, by the way, vacca is from the Latin, which means cow. So that improved the survival rate from variolation from 98.5%, it's saying 1.5% died, to 99.95%. That's a wonderful improvement, and we'll call that a medical victory. So I asked AI, hey, with modern medical science, with what we know today, with pharmaceuticals, nutraceuticals, et cetera, what would the probable death rate from smallpox be today? Well, 2 to 5%. That's a huge improvement over 1 in 7. So how about this from New England Journal of Medicine? Long before the World Health Organization's smallpox eradication program began, And despite low herd immunity, unsophisticated public health facilities, and repeated introductions, smallpox disappeared from many countries as they developed economically. So what happens when you develop economically? You have less toxicity in the environment, less pollution, better nutrition, less stress. All these things are big factors. They estimate that half to 60% of the world's population was vaccinated with smallpox when they declared it eradicated. So everybody doesn't have to be vaccinated to create herd immunity. But let's look at some of these plagues and what caused them. The Black Plague, by the way, the streets of in the Middle Ages were narrow and flowing with sewage, and that's a breeding ground for pestilence. So they're calling this the Great Horse Manure Crisis of 1894. And they actually said in 50 years, they actually expected that London, New York City, the same, they said would be buried under about 9 feet of manure. So if there's manure everywhere, and think about all of these horses, all pooping every single day, horse manure could be a source of typhoid, cholera, and other diarrhea type diseases, tuberculosis and other respiratory infections, tetanus, and anthrax. These are all pretty horrible conditions. Clean up the manure, clean up the problem. In the Middle Ages, open sewers, cesspits were common. No systematic waste removal, and therefore it was a toxic environment that created the Black Plague. Now, since 1900, they say there's been huge improvements in sanitation, number 1, hygiene, number 2, nutrition, number 3, and all of these have a lot to do with the decline of death rate from infectious disease, which, by the way, dropped 75% before widespread use of antibiotics, or even really any use of antibiotics, and over 91% before the broadened use of vaccinations. So think about that. Over 90% reduction in death rate from infectious disease before these vaccines were widely used. In 1960, kids got 3 shots. That's what I got. By 1983, they had gone up to 24. By 2024, 76 different vaccines. And worse than that, there's over 200 different vaccines in development. Now, these are vaccines that are mandated or mostly mandated in the States. You do have a few exemptions that you can use. But let's look at a few of these diseases. The death rate from measles dropped 98.5% prior to the measles vaccination. So in 1963, they just gave a measles shot. In 1971, they gave MMR, which, by the way, as they start combining these shots, we know there's more potential for adverse reaction. And keep in mind, in 2025, less than 5 deaths from measles. Now, who died from measles? Very sick kids. That's all that it really ever was. If we look at polio, historically, it's estimated that 0.1 to 1% were paralytic polio. Now, certainly I don't wish paralysis on anybody. 70 to 75% of polio cases were estimated to be asymptomatic. You look at pertussis deaths, there were 11 in 1980. They estimate 3 in 2025. So there's almost none of these going on. And let's take it a step further. The combined death total from diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, polio, measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox, influenza type B, and hepatitis B, the probability of anybody dying from that is actually, believe it or not, anywhere from 1 in 2 million to 1 in 10 million. Put that in perspective, the probability of you winning a 6-number lottery, about 1 in 14 million. So almost the same. The number of live births in the US in 2024, 3.6 million. Now, here's the question I have. If only the probability then, if there's a 1 in 2 million cause, we might lose 2 children. If there's 1 in 10 million, there's only a 1 in 3 chance that we'll lose anybody that year. We only lose 1 every 3 years. Is it worth injecting everybody with products that are known to be harmful? Now, take a look at this. US law classifies vaccines as unavoidably unsafe. You're injecting something into somebody, that's going to be unsafe. So what are the top infectious killers? Well, pneumonia and the flu, all the way up to 1986, HIV, AIDS, had about a 12-year run, 1987 to 1998. I guess that 12 years inclusive. Pneumonia and flu, again, 1999 to 2019. COVID-19 took over 20 to 2022. And then pneumonia and flu are back. If you start looking at the deaths, you can blow that up and look at that. You can count them on basically one hand, the death from infectious disease. And most of those are due to the flu. So what's the efficacy of the flu vaccine? You know, they do this all the time. 34% is the average over the last 25 years of flu shots. And what does that mean? The probability of someone who doesn't get vaccinated is 34%, 4% more than someone who does for the flu. Now think about that for a moment. 1/3 probability. What if you took your vitamin D, your vitamin C, your zinc? What if you got sunshine, good rest? What if you weren't obese, didn't smoke, weren't overstressed? You know, I can't remember the last flu. No, I do remember the last flu I had, COVID-19. I got it on purpose. I sought to get it to start propagating herd immunity early in 2020. I felt that was my duty to help the world beat the pandemic. Prior to that, I don't remember the last flu, and I've never had a flu shot. So maybe once prior to COVID, so twice in 60 years, I've had the flu. And it was probably a pretty rundown year for me, overdoing it, which, by the way, I could do more so in my younger years. If we look at HIV, I love Magic Johnson. I love his wisdom. I love watching him as a player. You know, when he got HIV, I thought, oh my God, how horrible. He's going to be gone in a few years. But guess what? Modern care, someone getting HIV today at age 30 can expect to live to between 76 and 78. And guess what? I bet we'll improve on that as well. So what's the bad of vaccines? They are classified as unavoidably unsafe. You're injecting someone with something, it's going to harm some people. So how about these three banners? Vaccines are not placebo safety tested. That's nearly all of them. The vaccine makers are exempt from liability. And by the way, who's making the vaccines? Some organizations that have been hit with some of the biggest criminal fines in the history of humanity. And then, of course, forced medical procedures have no place in a free society. So the FDA did approve the COVID-19 vaccine as safe and effective. Now, I want you to think about that. Vaccines are unavoidably unsafe. That's how they're categorized. But our FDA told them that they were safe and effective. Most recently, Robert Kennedy looking into the data. He's a smart guy. Some people think he's a conspiracy whack job. I promise you, this guy is quite brilliant and very capable of making a logical decision. He canceled the $500 million in messenger RNA vaccine contracts. There was something called the Great Barrier Declaration. Leading scientists wrote it. Over 1,500,000 scientists signed it, and over 930,000 public signatures. This was basically saying, look, let the healthy get COVID, create herd immunity, and we'll all be over this. We'll protect the vulnerable as the vulnerable need to be protected. So how have vaccines traditionally ended? Herd immunity is number one. Think about smallpox, right? 50 to 60% of the population vaccinated, no more smallpox. Public health interventions, that wasn't masks, that wasn't lockdowns, that was sanitation and hygiene. Treatments, they get better over time. Some drugs were good for COVID. Lots of nutrients were good for COVID. The blend of the two seemed to be best of all. There can be natural decline and mutation of especially viruses. And then finally, there's changes in the population and the environment. So I asked AI, if the Spanish flu were around today, how many people would die? They said at least a 75 to 90% reduction. And I'm showing a mushroom mug there because I have reishi mushroom in my coffee that I have every single day. And reishi reduced the death rate from COVID by at least 93% by March of 2020. This was a study of the International Journal of Biologic Science. They took people that were hospitalized with severe COVID. So it wasn't even mild COVID. They were severe enough to go to the hospital. And they compared what happened if they gave them Western medicine versus Western medicine and traditional Chinese medicine, of which reishi is the top nutraceutical in traditional Chinese medicine. Again, 95% reduction in death rate from infectious disease. So if you want to try some of my reishi coffee, bettercoffeeshop.com. I love it. It's my favorite easy way to stay healthy. So you start looking at Joe Rogan. He got bad COVID. Now, it's amazing how CNN tweaked that. I don't know if he sued him or not for that yet, but he got COVID and was over it from symptom to recovery in 5 days. He did the monoclonal antibodies, ivermectin, azithromycin, an antibiotic, prednisone, an anti-inflammatory, nicotine adenine dinucleotide, vitamin drips with high dose vitamin C, got over it really, really quick. Why was that not standard of care? Might be my question. Scott Jensen, this Minnesota physician, he was really mad about how the FDA and CDC were coaching doctors to put COVID on every death certificate that they could. He said it's ridiculous and misleading. And Oxford did an analysis, an audit of Italy's data, because Italy was just having people drop like flies from COVID. And what they found out was that 12% of the time that they called it a COVID death, it really was a COVID death. So 88% of the time they were calling it a COVID death and it wasn't. Why were they padding those statistics? And this Italian leader said, you know what, this is ridiculous. They're exaggerating the numbers to impose a dictatorship, lockdowns, and things similar. What happened in the US? 1 in 5 healthcare workers left their job, including 117,000 physicians and 53,000 nurse practitioners. The ones that I talked to, they said they just simply weren't getting the jab, and they were being forced to do things with patients that they felt would lead them to death rather than recovery. So I asked AI, what was the mathematical probability that a person with no comorbidities, that means they weren't obese, they weren't diabetic, they weren't hypertensive, under the age of 80, dying of COVID in 2020, 5 to 10 per million. That was the probability of a healthy person under 80 dying of COVID. So why did we have to lock down the whole country? We could have had herd immunity fast. They were even recommending these for pregnant women and newborn infants. RFK pulled that requirement. And just a review, the mRNA vaccine was something completely different. They injected you with genetic material that would go into your own cells and use your cell's genetics to make spike proteins. These spike proteins would go all over the body. We know that now. And this study found spike proteins were still in the body 709 days after the vaccination. So this is very, very risky. Now, there's a lot of people with post-vaccine syndrome. I've got a spike protein detox protocol. Send me a private message if you're interested in that. But they actually estimate that this was either very, very rare, like something like 3 in a million, to almost 2 out of 3 people. So how can the estimates be that extreme? I promise you it wasn't as rare as 3 in a million. Probably not as common as 2 in 3, but somewhere in between. It might be 1 in 3, 1 in 5, 1 in 10. I think it's at least that significant that 1 in 10 had challenges with this shot. I like Russell Brand. I think he's a voice of reason, a voice of logic. And he was going through all the things that were redacted from Pfizer and the things they didn't disclose. And he said, after this, do you know anybody that's pro-vax? The pharmaceutical industry, some of the biggest fines in the history of the planet, certainly including Pfizer. Why would you partner with a criminal organization? That's all we can say is they're a criminal organization to create something for the public. And I love this quote: crime, money, power, and drugs are all linked. Notice they don't say crime, money, power, and nutrition, crime, money, power, and health. No, it's crime, money, power, and drugs. So this author, Dr. Richard Moskowitz, says routine childhood vaccines are neither safe nor as effective as we have been led to believe. And I might suggest nowhere near as necessary as they once might have been, but they certainly are not now. So Moskowitz says this: with no serious public health emergency to justify them, requiring vaccines for everyone deprives all of us of genuinely informed consent. So here was an interesting study, Human Experimental Toxicology 2011. They found out that countries that gave the most vaccines had the highest infant death rate. And it was 30 countries that were evaluated. And the graph would go in the other direction. If more vaccines led to fewer deaths, that graph would be going downward. But instead, it's going upward on a steady trajectory. More vaccines, more infant death. Now, this at this point is correlation, not causation. So I'm not going to try to tell you that the vaccines killed these kids, but this is a pretty hard number to look in the other direction. So in 1986, the US took all the liability away from drug companies on vaccines, predominantly because of high lawsuits. The drug companies could not get insurance, and they still wanted to vaccinate the public. So vaccines went from 1970 from 0.5 billion globally to nearly 88 billion. That's a 176x increase in 54 years and over 3,300 since 1986. Now, let's look at the ugly. The surge in vaccine lawsuits were due to pertussis vaccine encephalopathy, brain swelling. The brain swelling from DPT and pertussis, they combined it with diphtheria and tetanus and or MMR were absolutely proven to increase seizures. Now, the medical people are saying, so what? It's a little seizure, no evidence of long-term harm. I've got parents of kids who had seizures after the vaccines that'll tell you they've never been normal again. We look at this rise in global autoimmunity, and it's just been going up and up and up. So you start looking at vaccine-induced autoimmunity, over 3,600 studies, and COVID-19 vaccine-induced autoimmunity, 527 studies. So think about that. I have a number of patients in my office that have had vaccine-induced autoimmunity. And then everybody's favorite Bill Gates, right? What was he saying in this TED conference? I don't think he'd tell the truth about it, but he said if we do a good job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could actually lower the population. What? Lower the population? How do you do that? Do you create infertility? Do you kill people? He didn't explain what he meant by that, but he's heavily invested in vaccines. He reports a 20-to-1 return on investment. He invested $1.75 billion in COVID-19 vaccines. Multiply that by 20, that's a $35 billion gain. Big Pharma made $90 billion the first 2 years of the COVID vaccines. So when we start looking at global excess deaths, there have been 5.42 million COVID deaths. That's what they say. Remember, the deaths were exaggerated. And nearly 15 million excess deaths since 2020. We start looking at excess deaths in the US. We've had over 2.3 million since 2020 excess deaths. And then we can start looking at excess millennial deaths. Millennials should not have died of COVID. So think about that for a moment. But the estimates are between 1.1 million and 1.4 million excess deaths. Now, how many people died in U.S. conflicts in all the total wars since 1775? 1.3 million. So we may have had more excess deaths the last 5 years among millennials, battle age people, essentially war age people, since COVID. How can that be? Young people usually do not just drop dead. LeBron James' son, cardiac arrest. He looks fit. He looks healthy. I think he's got pretty good genes. Cardiac arrest on the basketball court. Damar Hamlin, cardiac arrest on Monday Night Football, live on TV. I really thought that would have been the end of the COVID shots, but there was so much forcing them that they kept going. Robert F. Kennedy wrote Vax versus Unvax, Fact versus Fiction. 61 studies compare vaccinated versus unvaccinated, and they all have the same result. The vaccinated kids are healthier, and unvaccinated kids, let me make that clear, be clear. The vaccinated kids are sicker. The unvaccinated kids are healthier in every single category, especially in things like allergies. And RFK was saying, I don't know why my kids have so many allergies. I didn't have them. I think he said all of his kids have allergies. 30x allergy increase on vaccines. So Peter Hotez is in that picture. Joe Rogan interviewed him. There's RFK. Peter Hotez is a vaccine expert. Not a single vaccine expert or medical expert will debate RFK. Why? I say because he's right. They say, well, he's an experienced debater. He can twist things. He's going to use facts. That's what he does. Autism prevalence gone up exponentially. RFK is on record. He says the CDC covered up a study that showed that there was an 1,135% elevated risk of autism in kids receiving Hep B. If you look at Jenny McCarthy, she made the cover of People magazine. Her son spiraled into autism after a vaccine. She was fully convinced that's what did it. I probably have 100 parents in my clinic that's their same story. Their kid was perfectly fine, had a vaccine, spiraled down. She wasn't saying get rid of vaccines. She was saying clean them up, maybe be a little more sensible about how you go about combining them and at what age you give them. So today, this is a published medical fact. 93% of polio cases are caused by the vaccine. If you start looking at transmission of hepatitis B, HIV, things like that, IV drug needles, unsafe sex, dirty needles, tattoos, stuff like that. That's what transmits that. So why would we need to vaccinate a newborn infant minutes after birth for hepatitis B? AI says the average age of hepatitis B infection in the US between 30 and 40 years of age. Now, if a mom has hepatitis B, hey, let's treat mom. Let's treat baby. There are treatments. You don't prevent something that you already have. And the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program has paid out $4.9 billion. I want you to think about that, $4.9 billion. And that's money that's hard to get. So keep in mind, vaccine makers are exempt from liability. Forced medical procedures have no place in a free society. So I'm going to go back and ask the same question. Are vaccines still as valuable as they once were? Given there was such an extreme decline in infectious disease before we used them, there's pretty good argument that maybe not. Then we start looking at the combined probability of death from a disease that they vaccinate in, anywhere from 1 in 2 million to 1 in 10 million. And a healthy baby wouldn't do that. 3.6 million babies died. If it's 1 in 2 million, maybe we lose 2 to these vaccine preventable diseases. If it's 1 in 10 million, maybe we lose 1 every 3 years. So should we force every parent to vaccinate every kid to save 2 of 3.6 million? Or could it be that we do more harm by forcing the vaccines? A lot of people felt that was the case. Forcing vaccines during COVID did more harm than good. Maybe the same is true of these vaccines. As always, I'm Dr. Bob Rakowski, absolutely knowing that we can all be happy, healthy, and successful. So always do your due diligence, zealously inspect all things that you allow to enter your mind, your heart, your soul, and your body. I wish you a beautiful life. God bless.